Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for coming out. Today we're going to talk a little bit about video games. So I appreciate being invited out here, and we'll have time for questions at the end. But I'm going to kind of go through my journey as a game developer for you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what goes into game design. And this is from the perspective of me being a solo developer. And let me just introduce myself. I'm Jes Negrón. I've been in media in some way for almost 20 years now, but I didn't start out in games. So for anyone who's interested in getting into the video game industry, just know that that path can look like a lot of different things. I actually started out as a web designer. I made websites for local businesses at like 13 years old. I went to college for forensics. I was going to be a criminologist. And then I decided, you know what? That was kind of depressing. So I wanted to go into media. From there, I actually worked in the book industry for quite some time. I was a literary agent and then a children's book editor. You can probably in this very library read some of the books that me and my clients worked on. I did everything from science fiction to fantasy, children's books, picture books. And that was a really fun and great time. And that's kind of how I got my background as a storyteller, as a writer, as an editor. And from there, I went into video games. I've worked for a few companies, big and small. Some of the smaller companies making like narrative mobile games. I've also worked for bigger companies, probably the most well-known is Riot Games, League of Legends, if anyone's heard of that game. And then last year, I struck out on my own and I decided to open up my own studio. So I founded RETCON Games in 2021, and I have been working for the past year on our first release, which is Good Bones. The game I'm working on is a point and click adventure. It's sort of a visual novel format. So you have a lot of imagery, a lot of artwork, and a lot of the game is about searching for puzzles to solve the mystery of an old house with some dark secrets. It's a story about relationships between kids and their parents. It's a story about getting over grief, and it's a little bit of a story, a lesson about bringing awareness to domestic violence as well. It is something really close to my heart because it's a story I think a lot of people don't like to talk about. And I feel like this game is going to be a good way to kind of broach that topic and start those conversations in a really accessible way. Something kind of fun and engaging and with a little bit of mystery to solve. It's coming soon. So if you go on my website, retcongames.com, you can always put it on your wish list. It's going to be available for computers right now. And then hopefully in the future, I can get it on consoles for anyone who plays Xbox, Switch, PlayStation, what have you. I had some artwork to show off. We've got some technical difficulties, so won't be able to show that, but it's all available on my website. You can see a lot of the character art, a lot of the backgrounds, a lot of the gameplay. There's a lot of searching through a dark, spooky house to seek clues, figuring out puzzles, opening locked doors, searching for evidence to kind of capture the bad guy, that kind of thing. And throughout this whole process, I've really been able to put in a lot of my skills making video games. A lot of my experience I've been able to put towards this process because even though my background is in storytelling and writing. So much more than that goes into making a video game. And I'd love to know, I'm assuming all of you are interested in video games, are gamers, probably yourselves. Who's actually interested in like making games? I'd love to see. Yeah, great. You're gonna love this presentation then, because I'm gonna get into it a little bit. Basically, with a video game, like any media, you've got to start with an idea. And that idea, I always tell people, if you're going out on this journey on your own, you've got to keep it simple. Me being a solo developer, I am making this game pretty much by myself. I've been able to contract artists and musicians for the music and the artwork, but all of the programming, all of the writing, all of the planning and, arranging the game itself, I've been doing solo. That isn't always going to be the case. If you get into the game industry and you're lucky enough to get with a larger studio, there will be entire teams of people working on these things. So really it depends on where you end up. But I'm going to be talking about it from my perspective. So that's perspective of someone kind of forging out on their own. And for that, you really do need to keep it simple. I know it's really exciting to kind of think of all the game ideas if you want to make like a role-playing game or some epic Skyrim type adventure, or some sort of strategic tactical game. But those are huge. I mean, tens and hundreds of people work on these kinds of games. And if you're going at it alone, you really need to make it small. My game is a really simple story told over one weekend. It's something, small in scope, so I can handle it by myself. And if you're also working on your own or with a small team, you're going to need to make your idea, small in scope too. So when you're going out to create a game, it's great to shoot off ideas and stuff. And a lot of people want to jump right into creation. Whether you are an artist and you want to start making those characters or making that world, or if you're a writer and you want to start writing up the story, or if you're a programmer and you want to start building those systems and designing things, you actually have to take a few steps back, because so much of game development is actually in the planning. One of the first things you want to do when you make a game is create your game design document. This thing is kind of like your game go-to. You reference this throughout the game design process, and it will help you keep on track so your ideas don't get too big and you go, you start extending all the time you need to make this thing. It keeps you focused and it keeps you on track. And it also gives you a really good plan, just in general, to sort out your ideas, to make sure they're good ideas and that you can follow through with them. And, I think we've all had experience of having like a really great idea and then getting started and realizing you kind of need to step back and rethink some things because it's not working out the way you wanted to. And a game design document really helps with that. So there are a few elements to the game design document, and I'm not going to be able to go through every single part of one, but I'll go through a little bit of an overview. You kind of need your core pillars of the game. You need the game's design, the game's story, the game's art style. You need to know your audience, who you're making the game for. You need to know what platforms you want to make your game for, whether you're making a PC game like me, or if you want to make a game that's specifically for consoles or a mobile game. And you also need to know a lot of technical details for how you want to build your game. So in terms of core pillars, what this means is like the genre of your game, what type of game you want to make, what kind of players you want in your game. Is it going to be a single player experience? Is it going to be multiplayer? Is it going to be a giant MMO? You need quite the team for that, but I support you. And what kind of experience you want to make this? Do you want it to be really character focused and story focused? Do you want it to be a game that's mostly about tactics and strategy? Do you want to make something like, a shooter where it's team versus team? That's the kind of detail that you should start with when you're figuring out what kind of game you want to make. And once you kind of nail that down, those core pillars shouldn't really change. You shouldn't get, a year into developing your game and realize, you know what? I want my shooter to be a farming simulation instead. That's not a change in direction. That means you've got to start all over, unfortunately. So yeah, these core pillars are going to be really the foundation of your game, and it's going to be your guiding light moving forward. So the fun part, the design of the game. This is what kind of gameplay you want to make, what kind of mechanics, your hook. You want to be able to pitch people your game and talk about it and say, this is what makes my game unique. There are a billion farming sims out there. If anyone plays Stardew Valley, great game. But if you want to make something like that, what makes yours different? Maybe your game is a farming sim where you farm, I don't know, slimes instead of vegetables. And anyone who plays Slime Rancher knows that that's a really unique twist on that. And that's kind of what you have to think about moving forward is, what is my unique twist? There are a lot of shooters out there. If you play Call of Duty, if you play Valorant, if you play Fortnite, they each have elements that make their game really unique to them. So playing one is not necessarily the exact same thing as playing the other. I don't know if you know this about Fortnite, but it started out as a completely different type of game. And the type that got popular and that everyone started playing was just like a throwaway version of it. They were just like, oh, this might be fun. Let's put this game type out there. And it exploded because it felt different. It felt unique. It felt special compared to everything else that was out there. And now it's one of the top first-person shooters out there right now. So when you're thinking about the design of your game and what kind of mechanics, what kind of mechanics you want to design in that game, that's what you have to think about, is what makes your game unique? What's that special hook that's going to bring people in? And then, depending on the type of game you create, you do have to think about the world. A lot of people who are writers and want to get into video games don't necessarily know that there are like two different branches to narrative in video games. So there's the writing part of it and there's the design part of it. And the writing part of it is what most people know. You're creating the world, you're creating the characters, you're creating the story. And there are so many little details that you have to think up for creating that part of the game. When you're world building, you have to think about things like, what kind of clothing is available in this world? Is it just like a modern world like ours? If you're building a fantasy world, if they don't have the same kinds of plants or resources that we do here on this earth, you have to think about where they're getting their clothes, where they're getting their materials to build buildings. And that's some of the fun details that you get to sort out when you're world building. You get to figure out, are people flying cars? Are they riding animals to get around giant creatures? Are there monsters? Are there, what kind of music do people listen to in this world? What does the weather look like? Do they have 2 suns, 3, 4? These are all little details, but they make a world feel alive. They make it feel full. And you really get to control what it all looks like. And And then a big part of a game, if you're going character focused, is the characters. This is really important because this is kind of how your players are going to interact with the game. You want characters that are relatable to people, and that means so many things to so many people. You can have characters that share your experiences. You can have characters that share your style, that share your love of music, that share how you look, how you dress. You can have characters that, you know, grew up in the same area as you, or you have characters that have the same cultural identity as you. There's so many different ways to connect to video game characters. And when you're building your world, you really have to think about who's playing this and what's special about these characters that people are really going to be able to connect to. You know, there are lots of experiences that are, I don't want to say universal, but lots of experiences that we all have. A lot of us have the experience of being scared, and you can draw on that for your game. A lot of people have the experiences of being excited or being hopeful, or, you know, seeing something wrong and wanting to make it right and wanting to help people. And those are all elements you can put into your character's personality to connect with people. So even though, you know, you don't walk around carrying a giant sword and slaying dragons, you can share the experience with the character that you see, you know, a bad guy doing terrible things to the village, and you want to make that right. You want to be the hero. These are little details that you can use to make people connect to this world, even though the bigger elements of the fantasy or the sci-fi, what have you, you know, aren't part of our everyday lives, even though it'd be pretty cool to walk around and see dragons, if they were nice. And then the story. The story is really the thing that ties the whole experience together. If your game is story-based, you have to present a problem to your players that they want to solve. You have to present a situation that they want to get to the bottom of. And that will carry them through the game. You've got, you know, the regular highs and lows of any story. If you watch television or you watch movies, those are all stories, just told in a slightly different way. And the story of your game has to have those highs and lows so that folks feel connected to what they're doing. I think in game design, it's easy to like create this amazing world with these amazing elements and then release people in it, and they wander around and they're like, okay, but what am I supposed to be doing here? Some people like that style of gameplay. We call that like open world sandbox games, and some people don't. So it's all about setting up expectations. And if you're presenting people with a story game and they go in and they don't really have a good handle on the story, that means you as a game designer, as a writer, have to really think about what it is that you're asking your player to do. And when you can answer that question, you have a really good North Star for how to guide your player through this experience. So that's narrative writing. There's a whole nother half to that. That's narrative design. So once you've got your world, your characters, and your story, there's actually a whole field about how your player is going to interact with the story, how they're going to discover the world, how they're going to meet characters. And that's where narrative design comes in. So many games handle delivering their story in so many different ways. Some games you have to speak to characters and they tell you about what is going on in the world and what problems you have to solve. Some games, there aren't really a lot of characters, and it's up to the environment to tell you that story. So you're, you know, if anyone's ever heard of or played Fallout, that has so much environmental storytelling. You're walking around this apocalyptic world, and you see things that people have left behind. You see things that people have built, created. So many games have little notes that they leave, you can pick up and read. People leaving letters, people leaving documents. That's environmental storytelling. So you're not getting an idea of the world and the problems through characters necessarily, but in exploring the environment, it's telling you a lot about what's going on. And there's also, you know, the design of how the story unfolds, which is, you know, is it going to be a straight line? Is there only one way to experience this story? Do you give your players choices? Do their choices affect the endings? These are all narrative design issues. And so when you're designing a game, you have to figure out, okay, not only what story I want to tell, but how I want to present that story to the player. And like I said, there are a billion ways to do it. So many games have their own method. And it's, for me, as a narrative designer by trade, it's one of the most fun parts of designing a game, is figuring out, okay, how do I want the player to discover this story? In my game, Good Bones, it's a lot of environmental storytelling. You're able to explore this creepy house and click on just about everything you can see. And there's a little bit of text you can read about, the characters will comment on, you know, paintings on the wall, or documents that they find, or photos that they find, or investigating through a phone and being able to read text messages and discovering more about the story of whoever sent those texts. And it's all very subtle. And, you know, it's interesting to be able to explore through the house and really get a sense of who lived there and what they were up to without even talking to anyone. The next part of a game is the art. Video games are a visual medium. So, well, for the most part, actually. I mean, if you look at the history of video games, way back when, there were text-based games only. So you just read words on a screen and you're able to make choices. These days, it's mostly visual. You can figure out if your game is going to be 2D or 3D. And part of deciding on the art style is for figuring out what kind of mood you want to give off. For my game, I want it to be really spooky. I wanted it to be really sort of haunted. So the colors are really moody and the colors are really atmospheric, and everything in the house looks just a little bit spiderwebby and not taken well care of. So you're going through the house and it's got this really creepy vibe. Some games are not that at all. They want to give off a more vibrant mood. Again, Stardew Valley, it's very colorful, it's very bright, it's very happy. You've got games like Halo, where that whole visual aesthetic is very futuristic and sci-fi and very militarized. And it all really helps the player get into the game and be invested in the story and the characters with the right mindset. Can you imagine if Halo was like brightly colored and everything was like rainbow and bright and shiny? It wouldn't be as spooky. It wouldn't be as intense. Can you imagine if Stardew Valley was like dark gray and, you know, really, really spooky and scary? It would be a very creepy farming sim. And there are creepy farming sims out there. If anyone's played, oh gosh, I can't remember the name now. I think it's Gravekeeper or something like that. But the art style of the game really helps people get into the mood that you want them to get into while they're playing. It's really important to develop that mindset in your player. So there's a lot of visual style choices to make. There's a lot of what we call shape language. And that just means the shape of things even really affects what people think while they're playing the game. When things are round and bubbly and bouncy, it gives off a more cheery vibe as opposed to things that are more angular and sharp. And you can use that to your advantage. Part of art in games is also not just the visual aspect, but the audio aspect. The music, the sound effects, they're huge parts of what make a game really amazing. If you've ever played a game on mute by accident, if you forget to unmute your game, you kind of realize while you're playing, wait, something's missing. Because those little elements actually bring so much to the experience of playing. Little things like footsteps even, or the little beep when you select something on the screen. These are all decisions that people in game teams have to make. They have to get all of those little details down, what it's going to sound like when you click certain buttons, what it's going to sound like if you get injured in a game, or if you jump, does the character say something? We call those barks. If you've ever played a game with characters who are saying things, I can think of Call of Duty, especially. I mean, it's a billion ways to say the same thing, but without it, you would sense something missing, because it really helps you connect to the characters. So yeah, every time a character jumps and they're, they have that jump noise, or if they're laughing, or if they're grunting because they're swinging a sword, those are all decisions that the audio team is making. Making the audio can be pretty fun too. It's called Foley. It's the same thing in movies. And you'd be surprised at some of the stories that the audio team has when they're creating the sound effects for a game. Things like footsteps, you think, oh, they're just recording someone taking steps. And in reality, they're not. Sometimes it's someone just banging on a table. Sometimes it's someone tap dancing. For sword clangs, you have people banging on pots and pans. You've got things like people crunching up tinfoil to have the sound of walking on snow. It's really interesting, the different types of tools that you can use to make noises that don't even relate to what you're using. And there's also voice acting. That's a whole thing on its own. If your characters, if you want them to speak in the game, they have a personality. So you've got to write a script for them that fits what they're saying. If you want to be really skillful, you have to make sure that all that dialogue that someone would be able to tell right away without even looking, that it's that character, because it feels unique to them. If you think of your favorite video game character and think of what they say, you know that if you heard that on the radio, or if you heard it just, someone playing out and about, you would be able to recognize it, because the writers and the audio folks are making sure that those bits of dialogue sound really unique to that character. And that's what makes them stand out. And that kind of brings us to who you're making your game for. There's so many different types of video games. It's not just the most popular we see out there. There are people making games for entertainment. You can make games for education. I know growing up, I used to play games all the time that would teach me the alphabet, or teach me letters, teach me different languages, teach me how to type. Those are all technically video games, and they're educational. You can also have just video games for entertainment, like the ones we talked about earlier, and a mix of the two. There's no reason why games can't be learning experiences. The same way when you watch a movie or you read a book and something really speaks to you, a game can too. I know that some of my favorite games are the ones that really spoke to me about issues that I was dealing with. Things like feeling left out of friend groups, or feeling like I was too nervous to get up and speak, and seeing characters in games deal with these issues in the same way that I was dealing with them. It really helped me. And yeah, so even entertainment games can be learning experiences too. And that kind of helps you decide in your game design journey, like what age group are you making your game for? Because if you're making a game for a really, really young people, it's not going to have the same kind of content that you would make for like an adult game. If you're making a game for educational purposes, it's going to have like a whole different style than a game that you make just for like a party game. So figuring out what your audience is going to be is a really important part of game design. And you not only have to think about just the basic things like what age your players are, but also what are their interests? What are they into? What part of their day-to-day lives are they looking to escape from even, or get more information on? And that can help you design your game. I know some of my favorite games are things that I'm interested in real life, and it was cool to see a game on it, like PC building simulator. I love computers, and so games like that are fun because you get to build a little computer without having to spend $1 billion on the parts in real life. Or again, Stardew Valley. Like, I am not going to go out and buy a farm, but it's really cool to sit down and pretend to farm carrots for a couple hours while I dig through the caves for minerals and diamonds, and build up my barns for all of my pigs and horses and whatnot. And then you also have to think about, like, what can your audience afford? If you want to make this big, exciting game, I'm thinking of big franchise games like Uncharted or Tomb Raider. Those are huge games. They've got teams of thousands of people. They've got to pay all those people. That's why games are like $60, $80, $100 these days. If you're making a tiny game, like I'm making, you can put it out there for $15. And that fits perfectly with the audience I'm trying to capture. So there's a lot of like little choices you have to make in deciding, okay, who's going to really love my game? Who's going to want to play it? Who's interested in the type of topic that I'm making a game about? And those are all part of the design process, as well as what platform you're making it for. I'm making a PC game. There are console games. There are mobile games, which is its own huge world. A lot of people don't realize, like, that takes an entirely different process to make a mobile game. You have to think about what kind of devices people are holding, their cell phones. Designing a game for mobile is completely different than computer because you don't have a mouse, you've got a finger. Your screen is this big. So you've got to figure out, all right, I can't have a whole bunch of buttons because it's going to cover up the whole screen. That's a totally different design choice that you have to make. And then there's a bunch of technical stuff for game design. And this is the stuff where you're really getting into the nitty-gritty of, like, what kind of game am I going to make? Is it going to be a 2D game with just like flat art, like, the old Mario games, or platformer games? Is it going to be a 3D game with a whole 3D world where you can move the camera around and follow the character and have amazing graphics? those are choices you need to make. And that will kind of determine what game engine you're going to use. A game engine is, how do I explain this? It's kind of it's the engine of the game. It's what makes it run. It's what you're using to build all the pieces of a video game. For me, I'm making a visual novel type style point and click game. So my game engine I'm using is RenPy, and that allows me to build a game with 2D art. And it's simple, it's straightforward, it doesn't involve a lot of programming. And it's something that me as a solo developer can jump into right away. And if you're starting out by yourself and you want to make your own projects, that's something you can go home and use literally right now. Just download it and you can start right away. It's so simple and easy and straightforward. Then you have more complicated engines, things like Unity or Unreal. And those are platforms that a lot of the bigger games are built on that you see. A lot of game companies have their own engines that they build from scratch that aren't available to the public too. So there's so many different ways to build video games, and you don't necessarily need to know a lot of programming when you're first starting out. Especially if you're someone who wants to be part of a larger team, you can focus on your skill, whether that's, again, if you're a musician or if you're an artist or if you're a writer. If you're like me and you're going on it on this journey alone, then you do have to do a little bit of everything. But there are tools out there that you can use to make that easier. I didn't know anything about audio design when I started this, and that's something I had to learn. I had to learn, oh, you don't just throw music into a game. You've got to figure out, okay, in this moment, serious music needs to play to set the mood, and then I need it to get happier, and then I need it to get mellow again, and then I've got to have music in the background playing while people are searching around the house for clues. And that's something that was really interesting for me to learn. I had to teach myself programming. And luckily I was using an engine that didn't require a lot of programming, and other engines do. So there's really a lot of options to be able to start this game design process in a way that fits your skills and how much you want to learn. I started making games when I was 10. It doesn't take a lot of skill right away. I mean, you're not going to go out and make the next Lara Croft in one day, but you can definitely go and make, little point and click games, or, little story games where you can dress up a character, or even, like click targets to earn points. Those are all games. They're simple, they're short, they're not complicated, but that's kind of what you have to create to get better and better. And I was creating that stuff when I was really, really young. And now I'm at the point where I'm creating more complicated things. And, it's not as inaccessible as it seems. It's not this big mysterious industry. Like any industry, you got to work to get in it. And, you've got to have sort of a portfolio of projects sometimes. You got to do things on your own to prove that you're able to create the things that they want you to create when you're there. But it is possible. It's not any mystery. It's just like applying for any job. You just got to have the experience. And we're lucky we live in an age where we have the technology where you can get that experience on your own and go home and make little games and build up your portfolio. And then the last thing is just budget. Once you get all of that planning done and you know what your art style is going to be, what your game type is going to be, you got to pay for it somehow. Unless you're literally doing it all on your own, then you just have to pay in time, which is not impossible. That's how Stardew Valley was made. One person made that whole game by themselves, all the art, all the music, all the programming, but it also took them like 10 years. So you kind of have to balance things out like that. So if you want to hire a team to kind of make that time shorter, you've got to think about budget, and not just budgeting money, budgeting time. You know, video games take time, and part of the video game design process is figuring out what it's going to take to produce that. How long is it going to take to design all those buildings and color them and sculpt them? How long is it going to take to create all these characters, all the artwork, all the music? Because all of that stuff is done from scratch. So myself, I was working on a really tiny budget because I'm a solo developer. So a lot of it I did myself. And where I could, I hired folks to do the things that I can't do: artwork, music. Other teams have huge funding. You know, where I'm self-funded, there are people who apply for grants. A lot of art grants the government gives to help folks make art, and video games are their own kind of art. There's Kickstarter. I know a lot of folks have done Kickstarters to fund their games. And then there's the traditional route of like investors, which, you know, if anyone's watched Shark Tank, you go and you have to make a presentation and hope that's, you know, a billionaire is going to give you some money to make your game. So there are a lot of avenues to get into creating video games, and there are a lot of elements to it. And I think the most important thing to remember is just know that the goal is to have fun. At the end of the day, you're creating something that people are going to play and people are going to want to enjoy. And if you don't enjoy the process of making it, people are not going to enjoy the process of playing it. So keep that in mind. And with that, just make sure you keep in touch with me. You can go to retcongames.com. That's RETCON games.com. That's my site. You can see more about my game, Good Bones, and future games that are coming out. I'm also on Twitter and TikTok. If you want to see sort of behind the scenes stuff, I show a lot of behind the scenes of the artwork and the music and the creation on there. So I'd love to hear if you have any questions, not just about the game design process, but the industry, my game in particular, my journey, anything. I'm happy to answer questions. I saw your hand up first.
So what is the background in the program? College or start your learning process?
Sure. Yeah. So the question is, what is my background? I am not a programmer by trade. I'm an editor and writer. And I used that skill to kind of get into everything else. I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but I can get into it more. I started out in media just in general. I was a graphic designer. I made websites for local businesses. From there, I got into designing for local magazines. And from there, I got into literary magazines, where I was acting as writer and editor. From there, I was able to get into the publishing industry as a literary agent. I represented a lot of authors to companies like Harlequin, HarperCollins, Permuted. From there, that's when I got into video games. They needed a writer and editor. I was a writer and editor, and I was able to get into the industry that way and use my experience in books to help me with developing content for games. And once I entered into that world, I was able to work with so many teams, with so many disciplines, and be able to see all the different aspects of creating a game and really soak up all that experience. Right here.
So I think it's really cool that you went through a path of writing and coming out here. And I know that that's a lot of journey for a lot of people, but for some of the younger kids here who are looking at a path, and if you were to look back, like, so maybe what would would you suggest as a path? Are there certain, is college necessary? Are there certain degrees? What are these? Would you suggest going solo first? Or would you suggest getting experience in a big company? And if so, what kind of experience or qualifications are those big companies looking for when they hire?
Absolutely. Yeah, if I could go back and do it all over again, I'd probably do it the same way. I think my path was really solid in helping me get experience. For those starting out, that's of course me as a writer. I ended up going to college being an English major, and that really helped me develop that solid foundation and expertise to be able to take that writing and narrative development experience forward in my career. And it really depends on your interest if you want to get into gaming. If you want to be a programmer, definitely suggest learning how to program as soon as possible. So many programmers these days are actually self-taught. I know plenty who don't have a college degree and who are able to teach themselves because they started at such a young age. Like I said, I started making games when I was 10. And it looks like you back there are making games at a pretty young age as well. But as long as you start learning and developing those skills, by the time you get to the point where you are entering the job force, you'll have so much experience under your belt just teaching yourself, just creating your own side projects. A lot of people choose to go to college and get a computer science degree. And that's valid too. A lot of people will go to college and get specific game design degrees, and those have so many different programs, game design for narrative, game design from a technical perspective, being a software engineer. There are a lot of paths you can take. If you're an artist, a lot of people decide they want to go to art school. A lot of people decide they don't. I know tons of video game artists who are entirely self-taught. Really, what you want is to get at a point in your life when you want to enter the game industry where you have some sort of portfolio to show off what you've done. And that's going to be the most important thing, whether you get that portfolio from school or whether you get that portfolio from working on your own personal projects.
Voice acting part. Someone who really was voice acting, is there any big name voice actor, and not just a video game actor, but anybody that you would want to get in for one of your games if you could?
Oh my goodness. Wow, that is a tough question. There are so many amazingly talented people out there. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say I would love to voice act myself for a game. That would be amazing. But if I had to choose a famous person, goodness. Wow, there's so many. I think I would go with, oh gosh, I can't even think of someone. You know what? One of my absolute idols has always, as an actress, has always been Sigourney Weaver. I'm a huge fan of the Aliens franchise, and like Ripley, the character from Aliens, was so important to me growing up. If I could get Sigourney Weaver on a game of mine, yeah, that would be a dream come true. Sure. Sure. Gosh, for software, like I said, you want to build your game in an engine of some sort. And it really depends on what kind of game you want to make. And luckily, there are so many options out there. So many free options too. Some engines you have to pay for, a lot of them you don't. If you want to make a visual novel type game, for example, RenPy is great. It's free. If you want to make sort of a 2D point and click adventure, kind of the traditional style, there's Adventure Game Studio, which I believe is also free. If you want to make a role-playing game, kind of a pixel art RPG, there's RPG Maker, which isn't free, but it's pretty affordable. And if you want to make something more complicated, there are platforms like Unreal, like Unity, which are free to use up to a point. Those are a little bit more complicated and they involve a little bit more learning. But there's so many resources on YouTube. A lot of people I know discovered how to use these just by going on YouTube and watching tutorials and making sample games. So there's a lot of material out there to help you learn whatever technology you want to use to make your game. Right here.
What is your favorite genre of games? What more games that
You know, it really depends if I'm playing or watching. If I'm playing myself, I really like simulator games. It's just a lot of fun to be able to dive into a world and pretend I'm doing whatever they're doing. If I'm watching someone else play, I love watching people play horror. I'm a huge like Markiplier fan. I'm too scared to play by myself. So I'll just like hide behind a blanket and watch them play the games so that I don't have to, freak out and play those games on my own. Yeah.
Like a lot of different. I've had my good version of myself. I'm not sure about that. And I want to say that I have this connection to bring area.
So you know what? There's actually an amazing tool for that called Twine, which is 100% free. It lets you kind of plot out the branches of your story, and it's really simple to learn. And you can go in and start your story and present choices and split up the branches of the story and have the player interact and, figure out kind of like a choose your own adventure type of thing. It's actually a really, really great tool to use to teach yourself how to do branching stories for games, because so many games have that as an element, trying to, have the player have choices that affect the story and affect the game. And when you start small like that, that's a huge foundational piece of learning how to design story for game. And yeah, if you're the type of person who wants to get into programming, there are a lot of resources online, things like Code Academy, which has a lot of either cheap or free courses to teach you how to code. There are a billion different programming languages, and you can start small and work your way up. I started with Python. I know people who started with like C++, which is obviously more complicated. But yeah, there's a lot of avenues to get there. And online, there's so much material to help you figure out like what direction you want to go in. But yeah, definitely check out Twine. It's a really good tool. And like I said, it's free. Yeah.
So you said,
RenPy. Yeah.
you said that there is now still something.
Yeah. So it uses what's called a screen language. The engine itself is built in Python. And what a lot of modern game engines do these days is try to make it super accessible so that anyone can go in and start. So they have a bunch of stuff that's like, I guess you could call it pre-coded. So instead of writing out like pages and pages of code to make somebody say something in the game, they've already got that part done and built. So I can just put the name of the character and what I want them to say and click a button and boom, the character says it. So if anyone's used something like that, that's like, it's called a screen language. And it's kind of like coding, but like a billion times simpler because most of the math and weird stuff is done for you. There are also things like visual coding, things like Unreal Engine has blueprints, which is literally just blocks that you can connect. You don't have to know how to code at all, and you can go home and make an endless runner without any experience. You just like download the button, you say, okay, I want the character, so you put a little character block. You say, I want them to run this fast, so you just change the number on that block, you connect them, and boom, it makes it work. So there are a lot of avenues like that where engines have designed ways to make it more accessible for people who don't know how to code, but who still have that sort of vision and want to create a game. Unreal Engine, yeah. Sure. Actually, for young people who want to learn how to code, I would suggest you look at Scratch. It teaches the concepts of coding in a really simple way. Because coding is really kind of like, I don't want to say math, it's like a mix of math and writing. You're basically learning a lot of commands that make the program do certain things. So coding isn't like mysterious or complicated. It's just a lot of learning. Okay, what do I have to tell the computer to make it do that? And Scratch is a good way to start. It kind of teaches you the basics of this is what you tell a computer in order to make this show up on the screen. This is how you can make that thing move. And yeah, learning how to code is really about getting the basics and then slowly building up until you know more and more and more of those commands so that you can make, something huge. There are certain programs that programmers use. They're called text editors. But basically it is it's kind of like a special document that you write in, and it is able to tell the computer, okay, these are all the commands, so follow this. Yeah, but to start out, I would start with something like Scratch, because it's really going to help you get those basics down. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's definitely something good for, again, someone who's a little bit more advanced like you, someone who's just like starting out from scratch. That's kind of why it's called Scratch. Yeah. Yeah.
Where, any suggestions of like where to farm out some of the work to, like design documents, describe, we could programming or where would find it?
Yeah, there are so many resources for finding folks. I was able to find artists on site like Artists and Clients, DeviantArt. I get connected to so many different creatives through like Twitter, because people post up their work all the time. And Instagram, I found a lot of artists from Instagram, they're posting up their work. And it's about like just reaching out to people, making those connections. I was able to reach out to artists from Instagram. That's how I got artists for my game. They were interested in the project. You can even use sites like Fiverr. I wouldn't recommend them because the quality varies, but it is a platform that people use, to get themselves out there. So you can find some really amazing gems. I know my music producer for my game, I found on Fiverr, extremely talented individual, was able to make the music for my game in exactly the style I wanted. So yeah, it's kind of about going out there and seeing what people are posting. And when you see something that matches the style of your vision, reaching out and just asking the question. Yeah.
The one that said beginning from past couple of years ago, toxicity, burnout, crunch, things like that. As someone who did work with some of those big companies and is now independent on your own, did you find that culture was pervasive and
Absolutely.
Company that you worked through, I wonder from somebody who's lived through that, you kind of tell us what that was like and what made you think that there's no other way.
Yeah, absolutely. It is pretty pervasive in the industry. And luckily that's a known fact. So there are a lot of people working to make that change. When I was in bigger companies, I experienced it. There's this kind of expectation that you're going to work really, really long hours. So many companies feature like nap rooms, companies like Google, they've got these nap pods and it's like, oh, that's cool. You can nap at work, but also they're expecting you to sleep at work instead of going home. So, it's I try to play it off as a cool thing, but it's kind of like unhealthy. And it's about creating boundaries and making sure you have like a clear delineation between your work life and your personal life, so that you can stay on top of it, because it's so easy. I mean, you're working on video games, like it's so easy to get into it. You're having fun at work, you're creating stuff that's awesome. And you're like, yeah, I can put in a few 100 hours a week, no problem. So it's tough. It is tough. A lot of the big companies like to say, oh, a year working with us is like 3 years working anywhere else, because that's the amount of pressure you're under to just produce. I think that's like a major reason why I decided to go out on my own is, my vision for RETCON is not just creating games with like really meaningful stories, but also kind of retconning the idea that video game production has to be this like extreme experience. Because at the end of the day, like, we're making games, we're not. So I actually work a full-time job and RETCON on the side. So I would say technically I'm working more hours. Yeah, total. But for RETCON itself, I really made sure to go into this with like the right mindset of wanting to set boundaries for myself and not crunch. And considering I'm a solo developer, it's not like I have a publisher to answer to. So if I need to take extra time on something, I can take that extra time. Yeah. I think the biggest learning experience for me is really internalizing the amount of time that all these pieces take. I talked a lot in this presentation about planning and setting up your design document, and that's just really the start of so many pieces it takes to plan out a game design process. And a huge learning experience for me has been kind of building up even more respect for my colleagues in those big companies and how much work they were doing and how much they were holding in just their little piece of the game. For example, specifically audio, like I was like, oh, I can just throw music on the game after, it's an afterthought. No. That was a huge wake-up call for me to figure out like there's so much thought that goes into when music happens, when sound effects happen, when voice lines have to be spoken. Yeah, I've just gained so much more respect than I already had for all of the amazing teams that are involved in the company. Because having to do all of that myself is really, it's a huge undertaking for one person to do all of it. And so it's really a learning experience. Yes.
During the game, you start to huge undertaking.
Thank you.
We did a lot of different projects, like this one. I was just curious, because when you had crazy things happen that just run the gamut, I'm like totally unwilling client, to a machine going down in the middle of the project. So did you have any, problems or setbacks or minor catastrophes that sort of hit you sideways that you didn't expect along this path, and then what did you do to deal with it?
Oh yeah, so many, especially doing this by myself. You know, I didn't have a whole team to fall back on to help support getting through when I hit bumps in the road. I remember at the very, very beginning when I started this a year ago, my original character artist couldn't follow through with the project, unfortunately. So, you know, I had months of development done with that character art in the game, some of it placeholder, and now couldn't finish. So I had to go back to the drawing board. I had to find a whole new artist. I have to give them all the design notes, you know, going back and forth with sketches all over again, finalizing the design details, and then finally getting back to where we were in terms of having finalized characters and then finishing it off. Because in my game, it is static 2D art. There's not a lot of animation. So I have different images for every character's emotions. And the first artist had done one emotion for each character, but I need 5, 6 for each of them. So it's kind of like, okay, got to go back, start from scratch, design the characters all over again, and then finish those emotions. So that's probably the biggest hiccup in this process that I had. Another one is, you know, I really wanted a certain song in this game, and licensing music from a musician is its own complicated legal process that I had to go through. Luckily, I've done licensing in the past in my work for the book industry. So it was, you know, not easy to navigate, but certainly easier than someone who would have to learn that stuff from scratch. And yeah, just the whole process of reaching out to the music manager and the record label and negotiating the price and going through the contracts. And yeah, a lot of the life of a solo developer is paperwork, believe it or not. So it's great when I get to focus on the fun part of building the game, but a lot of the background is paperwork as well. Yes. Set really good boundaries. Treat yourself like you would treat somebody else, a client or a business partner. You wouldn't double book a meeting over somebody's lunch because they have to eat. So make sure you don't book yourself over your own lunchtime. Give yourself time to eat. You know, realize that at the end of the day, you're making a video game and you can't bring your full self to that artwork if you're exhausted, if you're tired, if you're hungry. Set good hours, set good boundaries, learn how to say no to yourself. Learning how to say no to people is hard. Learning how to say no to yourself is even harder because it's so easy to fall into the trap of, oh, I can work a little bit longer. Oh, it's okay. I can stay up a little bit later. I can deal with being tired tomorrow. Learn how to say no. Learn how to say, you know what, I'm done for the day and I'm going to come back to it tomorrow, refreshed with a full night's sleep, and your work is going to be so much better for it. Okay. Sounds like that's it. Thank you again so much for coming out.